And now we turn to ethology and evolution. So we are first going to briefly go over what evolution is and what it is scientifically, not just what is the popular conception of it. Then we are going to go over some background, then get to the basics, and then talk about exactly why we are talking about this with developmental psychology. So the first thing to say is that I understand that to some people, evolution is a controversial topic. And I just want to say that we can disagree on the extent to which evolution occurs and still have a productive conversation. If you have any issues about what comes up in this, please talk to me. On the slide, it says, come talk to me, but you can email me, whatever. And even if you disagree with anything that I say, it's important that you understand it. If you disagree with something, you should disagree with it for a reasonable reason. But I really don't think that we are going to have any religious conflicts in the way that we're going to talk about it, but I could be wrong. But please try to give me the benefit of the doubt. The goal is certainly not to downplay anybody's religious beliefs. So, the basic belief behind evolutionary theory is that behavior is the result of genetic inheritance. And this is one of the more important things. Evolution, for us, the definition of evolution is a change in gene frequency in a gene pool over time. And we're going to talk about what it is and is not practically. So, evolution involves phylogenetic change, as you see. And that means changes in a species over generations. And this is in contrast to ontogenetic change, and that is development in an individual lifetime. In this class, no one person can evolve. We will never say that someone evolves. When President Obama said that his views on same-sex marriage had evolved, it really pissed me off. Not because of what he said, the substance of it, but because he misused the term evolution. No one person can evolve. It requires generations for evolution to occur. So for us, the development of individuals follows patterns that were acquired by species in prior generations because it helped with survival. Now, young members of a species have to survive until they can reproduce and then send their genes to the next generation. And unlike what you might have talked about in biology classes, for example, for us, we think that even social behaviors are subject to evolution. And things like cooperation, communication, group cohesion, these are all aspects that are involved. So just think about it. Who would be more likely to survive? A person who wants to be around no people ever, or someone who is more social? Well, even more than that, who's more likely to have children and pass down those genes? If someone has a gene that makes them not want to be around other people, literally ever, they can't have children to pass that gene down. So that gene will die out. New behaviors arise through natural genetic variation, or mutation. And if they allow the organism to survive better, theoretically, they'll be more common in the population as a whole. For example, let's say that there's a population, 60 people, in generation 1. And each male-female child, it's evenly split, each male-female couple have 2 children, meaning that the next generation will also consist of 60 people. Well, let's say if we move on to generation 2, each generation 5 offspring die. Let's say there is a very fast predator. But in this second generation, there's this one person that you can see who's green, Mr. Green. Mr. Green has a mutation that results in some kind of a different trait. And let's say in this case, it's fast twitch muscles. They have more fast twitch muscles. So Mr. Green is simply faster than everyone else. Well, assuming that this trait can be passed down, that then when we go into generation 3, after Mr. Green mates with a woman, he passes this gene down to the next generation, and 5 more people die off in this population. And the 5 people who die off would not be, or be less likely to be at least, those who have this trait that Mr. Green had, because Mr. Green is faster than them. So he can get away, and his children can get away from predators more easily than the other people. So then if we get to generation 4, we have it down. Generation 5, again, 5 die off who are not the people who have this trait, and on, until, in theory, everyone, or at least larger portions of the population, will have this trait. This is evolution. Notice not any one person is evolving, it is the species as a whole. Perhaps a more simplistic example. Let's say back in the day, giraffes' necks weren't very long, but some of the giraffes had longer necks than others by random variation. And that meant that they could reach food high up in the tree. And then certain short-necked giraffes, as you see in the second part of this, would die off, leaving only the long-necked giraffes to survive and pass on their genes. This is why I was saying that I don't think this is particularly controversial, and I don't think this should run counter to anybody's religious or spiritual beliefs. So let's talk now about ethology. This is the study of evolutionarily significant behaviors of a species in its natural surroundings. The study of evolutionarily significant behaviors of a species in its natural surroundings. This began as a distinct discipline in the 1930s, when Konrad Lorenz and Nico Tinbergen, both of whom eventually won a Nobel Prize for their work, came along and looked at animals not as just passive organisms, prodded like in learning theory, but instead as active organisms living in an ecological niche. And they looked at tons of different kinds of animals, ducklings, butterflies, fish, etc., etc. And Lorenz was a different kind of guy. Many of his observations were of wild animals that wandered freely in and around his home. Now, developmental psychology is related to this discipline through the natural observations of children and an interest in the biological basis of their behavior. So we have these people interested in why animals, how they develop, why they are biologically doing what they are doing, and developmental psychologists are interested in that in people as well. Of particular importance to developmental psychology is John Bowlby, who is the father of attachment theory, which we will get into in a couple lectures. Ethology helped balance out developmental psychology from the extremes of learning theory. And ethology has continued to influence science today. For example, in comparative psychology, cognitive neuroscience, behavioral neuroscience, evolutionary biology, evolutionary psychology, all over. And each of these areas have aspects that you could place the term developmental in front of them. So developmental cognitive neuroscience, developmental evolutionary psychology, etc. Now, today the work is more experimental and less theoretical than the classical ethological experiments. And instead of speculating on the evolutionary origin of behaviors, people may look at the immediate causes of behaviors, although there is still a lot of theory going on. And for those of you who have taken biology classes, you might have heard of E.O. Wilson. What we're talking about has substantial overlap with sociobiology and E.O. Wilson's work. And E.O. Wilson's work was really, and sociobiology in general, was about the study of the biological bases of social behavior. In particular, population genetics, kin selection, which we'll talk about in a little. Evolutionary psychology came after criticisms of sociobiology, and traces of current psychological functions to adaptations of our ancestors was one of the areas they were interested in looking at. Now, evolutionary psychology tries to combine evolutionary biology, cognitive psychology, and other fields. And in order to look at how the mind has been shaped by natural selection to solve problems faced by ancestors, they have taken aspects of all of these fields and tried to kind of pick the best of all worlds. Interestingly, many people now say that there is currently little evolutionary selection occurring in humans due to modern medicine, technological advances, social services, in part because, remember, if you pass down your genes, then you are no longer subject to the evolutionary influences of the past as much, at least. So cancer is something that's not going to get eliminated evolutionarily because most of the time people don't get it as children, and also it's not biologically based. So if we are doing a good job, which we are, of keeping people alive until they are able to procreate, then we are going to have less evolutionary selection effects happening. So species-specific innate behaviors are things we are very interested in looking at. Now, these are innate behaviors, and innate behaviors are those that are essentially behaviors that are essentially the same in all members of a species. These things are inherited and at least had some adaptive benefit at some point in time, like organs in the body. But like organs, the appendix, for example, they might have had a use, but might not anymore. And that's not contrary to evolution. Just because the appendix doesn't really do anything anymore doesn't mean that evolution is not occurring. It just means that it used to have a purpose, but might not now. Also, just like how bodily structures are under genetic control, which is typically what we think of, so are certain behaviors. So if genes can make us all grow 2 eyes, why couldn't it make us do things in a certain way? Behaviors are thought to be innate if they have the following qualities. 1, if they have an invariant form across members of a species, meaning that across a species, people do it in a similar way, not just people, animals, whatever, do it in a similar way. The way humans walk, we generally speaking walk in a similar way. Second, that these are present without relevant previous experience that could have made it learned. Basically, that the behaviors cannot be learned, they must naturally occur. And 3, if they are relatively unchanged as a result of experience or learning. If the whatever it is does not change because of experience or learning, then that could indicate that there is something very important, evolutionarily significant about why it happens. So for example, in certain songbirds, the same song appears in all members at sexual maturity, even if they have never heard the song sung by other members of the species. So you might say, well, maybe they learned it. People have actually taken the eggs of birds, songbirds, from nests and raised the chicks in isolation without hearing anything, without being around mom, anything like that. and at sexual maturity, they still sing the exact same song, which is kind of amazing. And this also points out that some innate behaviors don't present themselves until later in life as the result of physical maturation. So for humans, puberty doesn't happen until later in life. But that's not something we have to learn how to do, it just kind of happens. And if two behaviors are present across a species, two unique behaviors are present across a species, then you can make two inferences about that behavior. One, the two species are related, having a common ancestor of some sort. Or two, that the action evolved independently in two species, possibly because of a common environmental need. For example, children who cling to their mothers. It could be that chimps who, when they have children, cling to their mothers, and that some lizards whose children cling to their mothers are closely biologically related and have a common ancestor. Or it could be that behavior helped baby chimp and baby lizard survive, both of them survive, and so it could have evolved separately in the two species. Of particular interest to us are reflexes and fixed action patterns. A reflex we've talked about before in Piaget. A reflex is a simple response to a stimulus. So children grasping a finger placed in their hand, spreading their toes at the bottom of the foot when it's stroked, turning towards a nipple when their cheek is brushed, all of these kinds of reflex, the rooting, Babinski just mentioned, many reflexes are surprisingly strong. A premature baby can actually grasp a clothesline and support its weight immediately after birth. Meaning that if you took a premature baby, you had a clothesline, you put its hands on the clothesline and let go, it would likely be able to hold on, which is crazy. Now that reflex goes away after a little while. And let's remember back to Piaget. What did Piaget say about reflexes? That we had these reflexes and then we learned them. They were later, through assimilation and accommodation, the building blocks that led to later behaviors. Classical ethology emphasized fixed action patterns. These are complex innate behaviors that promote the survival of an individual and thus the species. More scientifically, it is, quote, genetically programmed sequences of coordinated motor actions. So, what are these things? Well, an example, squirrels bury nuts. Spiders spin webs. Birds perform courtship dances. You guys might have seen some of these. Fixed action patterns can be even more elaborate. There's a type of bird called a bowerbird. They spend hours building a nest with flowers, fruits, shells, and colorful beetles as decorations. Now, these are not called fixed action patterns as much as they are called modal, M-O-D-A-L, action patterns, because it turns out that these are actually more flexible than they were originally proposed to be, but nonetheless, we can stick with fixed action patterns. Fixed action patterns are elicited by a sign stimulus. Sign as an S-I-G-N stimulus. And this is a particular stimulus that automatically triggers a fixed action pattern. Lorenz said it was like a key opening a lock. So some fish have a sign stimulus when another fish of the same species come to their territory. And this causes a fighting behavior in the fish. If we take a decoy that only vaguely resembles the fish, it will elicit the fighting behavior in some of these fish if it has a red on the lower half of the decoy. If it doesn't have red on the bottom half, it usually doesn't elicit that behavior. So the sign stimulus is the red lower body. Another one, hens do not rescue flailing, distressed chicks if they see them under a glass, but do not hear them. If she hears them, if there's a little hole in the glass or something, she will immediately come over and try to rescue them. So it's not the movement that is important for the hen, but instead it is the sound. Another one. Female rats will try to retrieve their pups immediately after birth, even if none of them are present. Meaning that if a rat gives birth and then a human comes in and takes those babies, then the female rat will grab her tail repeatedly and take it back to her nest. I know, what do these have to do with developmental psychology? Well, not as much, but they're just shockingly interesting, at least to me. This is why some fishermen will use lures that are just exaggerated versions of natural prey. Because if you have a sign stimulus that says attack, and a fish will attack it, you got a better chance of getting them to bite. Now, humans obviously have these too. If an infant didn't get enough opportunity to suck during feeding, if they got full, but they didn't have enough, or if they didn't get full, they might end up making sucking movements even when there is no object present. You guys will probably see this. Oftentimes when babies are trying to get to sleep, they will do that. Now, this doesn't mean that all actions are fixed. Birds will build nests, but through trial and error find out that there are more suitable materials. So if you took birds that did not have a fixed action pattern regarding nest building, you took two of the same species of birds with no fixed action pattern, put them in different environments, they would make a nest, but they wouldn't necessarily make it identical. They just use materials that are present in the environment. So what this means is the general course of some actions are set, but there can be variability that arises due to the environment. And flexibility here is good, right? If you have a nest building behavior that relies on a single source of material and nothing is around, what will happen? Well, they won't be able to build a nest. Similarly, pandas eat bamboo. That's it. They can't live many places, in part because they don't have bamboo. It's good to have flexibility. So it's not just these behaviors that we're talking about for the importance to developmental psychology. What I'm trying to do is build up over time and help you see how these basic biological tendencies can become more and more related to what we are interested in. Learning predispositions can also be influenced here. Species differ in what aspects of their behaviors are modifiable, when they learn best, where they learn best, how they learn, things like that. Learning predispositions include sensitive periods and imprinting. Sensitive periods are also called critical periods, are specific periods where animals are biologically ready to acquire a new behavior. You guys have probably heard of at least the critical language period, where if you do not learn language before the age of 10 or so, you're going to have a lot harder time to do it, and at times can't at all. During these times, animals, humans, are especially responsive to particular stimuli that have certain behaviors that are susceptible to modification. Konrad Lorenz had the most famous example. After birth, certain birds, in his case geese, have a day or two where they are most able to learn their mother's characteristics. And these young learn to follow a stimulus and prefer it. This is called imprinting, when in the first couple days they learn something and it follows them through life. Imprinting increases survival of these young birds because it ensures that they stay close to their parent and therefore food, shelter, protection, and they learn how to be a bird. Now, stimuli are followed if certain criteria are met. It could be that birds have certain calls that they make, sounds that they make, or certain movements. And criteria vary from species to species, but the mother always fits the criteria for these birds. So we've all seen ducklings follow their mothers, but Lorenz found that there were less natural stimuli that it could happen with as well. Young birds have been imprinted on flashing lights, electric trains, moving milk bottles, and even Konrad Lorenz himself when he squatted and quacked. Other examples found that horses and sheep have become imprinted on humans. So Lorenz thought that imprinting was critical because he thought it was irreversible, meaning that if a mother comes up to a gosling after the gosling has been imprinted on a train, that they won't move back towards the mother. Now, he was a bit extreme in his notion that there was a lack of reversibility. It is more flexible at times, but still important. And this also has big implications for attachment in humans, as we'll see shortly. There are some interesting long-term effects of this. Jackdaws, another kind of bird, when raised by humans, will join other jackdaws but return to humans during their reproductive season, even trying their mating patterns on humans. So they go off and do their whatever birds do, and then come back to humans during their reproductive season. There are also sensitive periods for songbirds, distinguishing males and females of species, acquiring language, forming bonds between newborns and mothers. For goats, mothers bond in the first 5 minutes after birth. But if the young are removed at birth for 2 hours and then returned to their mothers will actually attack them when they return. But if you wait and let the baby stay with the mother for 5 minutes and then remove them, then return them 2 hours later, it doesn't happen. She doesn't attack them. So there's this 5-minute critical period for goats after they are born. Developmental psychologists have drawn heavily on the concept of sensitive periods. You have already heard of some, even if you don't know it. Freud, for example, thought early experience was the most important thing for adult behavior. Piaget had the sensory motor period. In fact, all stage theories claim that at certain ages, a child is sensitive to certain experiences. That's why they have a stage. And even in non-stage theories, most of them at least use the concept of readiness, biological readiness, where you must have the proper physical development in order for social forces to impact you. We saw that even in social learning theory. They're not that interested in biology, but they admit you must have the proper biological development in order to act. Sensitive periods are particularly important during pregnancy and in embryonic development. We will see later in the semester that at certain times in embryonic development, certain aspects of the body can be more or less affected by environmental factors like drugs. So what is the methodology here? Well, there are 2 general methods. As you can see, naturalistic observation and laboratory experiments. Now, both of these are necessary in this field. You can't do one or the other. The big difference in methodology for ethologists is naturalistic observation, and this even differs from sociobiologists and contemporary evolutionary psychologists, because they say that naturalistic observation is critical. And it makes sense for them in particular because if you're looking for the answer to how is a learning predisposition evolved to lead to survival, you would actually need to see that action in their natural environment. So if you take a squirrel and you bring it into a lab and it starts digging at the concrete floor, you might think that the squirrel's crazy. That action does not make sense in a laboratory. If you took a bird into a lab and it started dancing around oddly like we saw, what does that mean? These things don't make sense out of context, so you have to see them in their natural environment. You can see the function of the behavior by seeing how it fits into the species' natural environment in order to fit the animal's needs. In addition, not being able to see the purpose of the behaviors means that sometimes the change of scenery can change how animals act. They might not act in the same way in labs. For example, some animals can kind of go crazy in captivity. That's why people have made pushes for in zoos to have larger environments, so animals aren't just walking back and forth in this really small confined space. So what is it that they actually do practically in their methodology? Well, the first is they develop an ethogram. And this is a detailed description of behaviors of a species in its natural environment. They'll describe the animal's behavior, details of the environment, and events that precede and follow the behavior, as well as the frequency of the behavior, the function, anything like that. They also pay careful attention to describe the environment in great detail. So they were similar to Vygotsky in that they said that you can't understand a behavior without knowing the environmental details of the behavior. And as one quote puts it, quote, if we specify in detail the niche of a fish, its medium, its predators and prey, its nest, etc., we have in a way described the fish. End quote. So similar to you, if think about yourself, if someone were to describe you and describe where you go to school, what your family is like, what your friends are like, the environment you find yourself in when you're in free time, that in a way would be a pretty good description of you actually. And when people do these descriptions, they must be refined until two or more independent observers can agree on it, on all of it. Because one person could see something and just be wrong. So they've got this ethogram now. Second, they classify behaviors according to their function, how they aid survival. Is it caretaking? Does it defend territory, aggressive, whatever? And these classifications become working hypotheses. Then third, they'll compare the behavior in different species and how different behaviors meet the same need in other species. This could indicate that species could be related in some way. Fourth, they will use laboratory experiments to determine the causes of behaviors. And this is where ethologists say that psychologists have gone backwards, that psychologists oftentimes work in the lab to speculate about behavior in the environment, and it should go the other way around. And now let's get into the laboratory experiments in a little bit more detail. So they will look to the origins of the behaviors they see and the immediate causes. They can speculate about the evolved purposes of behaviors, but also about why the behaviors occur in general. So spiders spin webs both because it helps them survive over generations, but also because individual spiders need food. Both of them can be true. One classic experiment that these people often do is a deprivation experiment, where they will look to try to see if a behavior is innate or learned. And they would deprive an animal of a specific experience that might be relevant towards some behavior of interest. So one experiment gave squirrels in isolation a cage with a bare floor and a liquid diet. They did not get any nuts. And squirrels also in this experiment didn't see other squirrels in order to learn squirrel-like behaviors. So they didn't get nuts, they didn't get soil, they didn't get to see other squirrels. But they still started doing their nut-burying behavior at the same age that a typical squirrel did. This would include burying a hole, so clawing out a hole, or attempting to, at least in the concrete floor, pushing a nut into the hole with their snouts, covering it with invisible soil, patting down the soil. And because they had no experience with this, it has to be innate. There's no other explanation of why they do it. Other experiments they do are not really any different than other schools of psychology, but the purpose is different because they are looking to see if behaviors are there, or why the behaviors are there for the survival of a species. So attachment, as I said previously, is a really big part of this. John Bowlby is credited with bringing ethology to developmental psychologists. Because of World War II, there were many orphans in Europe, and therefore a large concern about maternal deprivation. This is kind of a deprivation experiment, right? There's no mother because they died during this war. He observed many of these children and led him to conclude that early attachment between an infant and caretaker is crucial for normal development. And he said that if there is a disrupted relationship between a mother and an infant, the infant is often first upset, then in despair, then has a detachment, and in some cases becomes pathological. He drew on the mother-infant attachment research in non-human primates and proposed that attachment to a caregiver evolved because it promotes the survival of infants by protecting them from predators and being exposed to the environment. Think about what would happen to a human infant if they were born and then just left on their own. They would die relatively shortly after that, or be exposed to predators. So it might not be that they starve to death, or they could be eaten by a lion or something. So just like in humans, separation from a mother in many species can be fatal. So from birth throughout development, infants who have a biological predisposition to maintain proximity to adults will be better off. So kids who want to be around their parents early on are more likely to survive than those who do not. In some animals, this is done through smell or a nest, so children stay put even when a mother is gone. And this can actually be seen in reflexes in humans. The grasping reflex, if you put an object like a finger into an infant's palm, they will grasp tightly on it. And some people think that that came from primates, where primates will cling to mother's hair. And that's how they'll get around, one of the ways they'll get around. Many of the reflexes don't matter in human infants, since we don't literally cling to parents. However, signaling mechanisms, like crying and babbling and smiling, are more important in humans. So signaling behaviors communicate needs and encourage adults to come to infants. If you guys have ever been around an infant when they start crying, it's like this blood-curdling scream that just because you are human, you are evolutionarily predisposed to behaving in a certain way, or at least paying attention to something. And this serves a purpose like imprinting on ducks. It keeps them safe. It's inherent in people. They don't want to hear kids cry because it's painful. Sometimes it's not even that you want to be there to make the kid feel better. Oftentimes it can just be you want the kid to stop. And how do you get the kid to stop? You go over and hold them. Well, that keeps them safer. And oftentimes these things are more complex than reflexes and might even be considered fixed action patterns. There is also research supporting the notion that some signaling behaviors are innate. So infants who are born blind or blind and deaf get social smiles around 6 weeks, just like infants who can see. So theoretically, you would think that an infant would start smiling because of something like social learning theory. They see parents smile, they accidentally one time smile and or try to imitate them, and then they're reinforced so they smile. But in blind or blind and deaf children, they don't see it. Those who are born blind and deaf don't see these smiles, but they still smile. And children born blind and deaf actually have many of the same behaviors as typical children, including laughing, crying, babbling, and some um, basic facial expressions. It is unlikely that these behaviors are taught, especially so early on, so it supports the notion that they're innate. Now, some people have actually said that, well, maybe the children are learning by touching their mother's face. But then people looked at children who are born blind, deaf, and with no arms, and they found that they also showed these typical facial expressions. So it seems like they're present without learning, they don't change, it's probably that these things are innate. Bowlby said that reflexes, signaling devices, and a tendency to look to faces lead to adult attachment. Then, at 6 or 9 months, at the time when separation anxiety comes in, attachment to one or two specific adults. So early on, right after birth, as long as you're getting fed, it really doesn't matter who you're around as long as you're around someone to take care of you. But then later, it's one or two specific adults who you would attach to. Then when they get to the 6 to 9 month time, when stranger anxiety comes in, they cry, which is a signaling behavior, which gets them back to their desired adult. I remember when this happened with my first daughter, when she got to this about 6 or so months old, and she started just freaking out when other people would be around. Or if not that, she would only if not that, she would just smile only at my wife and myself and no one else, which was kind of awesome in a way. This account of attachment flies in the face of some earlier work, specifically with learning theory. It said that children attach due to rewards from food or physical contact. And further, attachment occurs even if an attachment object, parent or caretaker, abuses the infant. This is one of the sadder things you'll see in abuse situations, is infants still are attached to abusive parents, at least for some time. Now, in addition to the child behaving in ways that brings that brings parents closer, adults are also predisposed to attach to children. This is partially why there are emotional bonds to children even before birth. And this makes sense. For a species where parents have to put a lot of investment into their children, those that survive will be the ones where parents gladly do it. It's better to be happy about parenting than not. You will put in more extra behavior. You'll help your children out more. And infants elicit attachment through signaling behaviors and their appearance. Infants of many species, especially mammals, have certain physical characteristics. For example, you can see on these slides, heads that are larger in proportion to their body, large foreheads relative to their face, short and heavy limbs, large eyes below the midline, round, prominent cheeks. This is called cuteness. This is why, as you see on the right-hand side, the cute character, many cartoon characters have a similar facial structure, large foreheads, big eyes, and the like. This is what cuteness is. This is also one of the reasons that we'll talk about this later in the semester, but my older daughter has Down syndrome, and it's one of the reasons people think that adults with Down syndrome are treated at times like more childlike than they actually are, and to lower capabilities, because some of the characteristics of Down syndrome are actually the cute characteristics: large forehead, eyes below the midline, shorter ears, heavier limbs, etc. Smiles are also an elicitor of attention. This morning, actually, my younger daughter and I were playing. I was tickling her, and she just started smiling. She's about 6 weeks old right now, and it got my attention. Let's just say that I was there taking pictures of her and playing with her and all of that. And smiles might have evolved so, and some people actually say this, evolved so that an exhausted mother will feel that the first months are worthwhile. When infants are eating every 2 to 3 hours and mothers are getting no sleep, there's got to be some reason for it. And I swear to God, for me, it's happened as well. When I wake up in the morning sometimes and I go in and see my daughter, my younger hasn't yet to start smiling when she wakes up. But my older one, she definitely started. We'd go in there, or I would go in there, and she'd look up at me at 4 in the morning and just smile, and it would make everything okay. Now, everyone is this way, but there are some interesting findings with this. For example, one study found that 12 and 13-year-old girls who had begun menstruation rated pictures more positively, rated cute pictures, pictures of children more positively than same-age boys and girls who had yet to start menstruating. So it seems like maybe this child-rearing capability makes you think that these kids are cuter. However, across cultures, experience with children, the greatest response to infants is always in the childbearing years. So this is, in large part, what attachment is talking about. There's this emotional bond that people have, we're going to talk about in a little while, that can be elicited. So how does this develop over time? We know newborns are predisposed towards attachment. They prefer to look at people's faces than other objects. They make happy sounds in response to human voices, but not other similar pitch sounds. They can discriminate their mother's odor from others. For example, in one experiment, 2-week-old breastfed infants turned towards a pad that was worn by their mother in their underarm, more so than a pad worn by another lactating female. There's really interesting work that shows that even young breastfed infants can tell their mother from smell alone. And mothers can do similar things. One study showed that 6 hours after birth, and after only one exposure to their baby, blindfolded mothers could pick out their child from smell alone out of a set of 3 babies. That's kind of crazy. And again, we'll talk about this more in the attachment lecture. So let's get to the developmental issues. What is the view of human nature? Well, because there's no one person here in this theory, there's not one view of human nature. Lorenz emphasized, a more mechanistic viewpoint where there's this automatic imprinting that occurs. Bowlby said that people were more organismic, that people meet demands of their environments. So it really depends. In terms of qualitative versus quantitative development, it can be both. It's not a stage theory, so there aren't the same kind of qualitative changes. But there can be qualitative changes when biological maturation leads to some new fixed action patterns. And also, sensitive periods are somewhat qualitatively different than others. But changes can be quantitative when you look at it over time. So it's both. Nature to nurture, nature versus nurture. It would be easy to think that this is nature, but that's actually incorrect. They're interactionists. They look at how genes and the environment interact to produce behavior. So genes allow for predispositions, but none of these people would argue that nature does not shape individual people following their dispositions. And then lastly, what is it that develops? Well, what's developing are behaviors that are species specific and that are essential for survival. attachment, dominance, eating, mating, whatever. And they will look for similarities in humans and other animals to help us figure out what is developing, how it is developing. Finally, evaluation, the strengths. Well, as a theory, most theories look at immediate causes, um, like how do children, or how does parenting vary cross-culturally? Well, ethology expands this to look at adaptive value and how the behavior was shaped over generations and generations. So it has long-term questions, long-term implications that others simply don't have. Additionally, methodologically, um, there's a famous psychologist named Yuri Bronfenbrenner, and he said that developmental psychology was, quote, the science of strange behavior of children in strange situations with strange adults for the briefest possible periods of time, end quote. Basically, what he was saying there was developmental psychology took children out of their home environment, brought them to a lab they've never been in before, where they interact with adults who they've never interacted with before. They're asked to do tasks they've never been asked to do before, and they only do it for an hour, 2 hours, something like that, and then they're gone. Basically, we're looking at kids outside of their natural environment and for short periods of time. So the biggest contribution of this perspective is the method of observing behavior in its natural context. While it's not a surprise that looking at children's behavior in the home or school would be important, ethology provides a theoretically based set of observational methods. And this is valuable when combining this method with traditional developmental laboratory experiments as they want it. And then finally, content. They added areas of interest in developmental psychology, especially in attachment, social behaviors. We knew parenting was important, but some of the most important insights into parenting were based from these perspectives. And then weaknesses, the theory. Well, the first is that ethology describes more than it explains. If we say a child acquires something because they're in a sensitive period, this is similar to Piaget saying infants acquire behavior because they're in the preoperational period. It kind of explains it, but it doesn't say how it happens. So questions like, what are the processes by which sensitive periods begin? Are the effects of contact between mother and children because of biological or cognitive variables? These things aren't answered in the theory. Methodological limitations. Most critical experiments aren't ethical. We can't deprive children of seeing a smile for weeks after their birth. One example, Frederick II in the early 1200s, he actually raised some babies in silence and near isolation to see if there was natural human language. Unsurprisingly, many of these kids died early in life. We're not doing this. Instead, we rely on naturally occurring experiments, as we're going to talk about when we talk about puberty. We'll look for infants who are born blind or deaf, infants of mothers who are hospitalized after birth and therefore not absent, but there are still ethical concerns here, taking advantage of situations. Also, there are problems with observational methods. It's tedious to do this. I was fortunate in graduate school I didn't have to do this, but many, I dare say most PhDs in developmental psychology had to spend hours and hours videotaping interactions between children and their environment, then describing it, coding it in a methodologically rigorous way, and then going back and looking at the tapes that they had and see exactly how long, how many seconds kids were doing certain behaviors. It can take hours and hours to even get through a short period of time on a videotape in this way. And then you have to have multiple people do it for reliability concerns. There's also a concern that having an observer there might alter things. If you want to understand human sexuality and apply ethological methods, that gets icky. And then The third, conceptual problems come up in dividing behavior into units. So if a child crawls away from a parent, is that what is important? Or is it the number of feet that the child went? Is it the direction? There are many questions that come up. And lastly, content limitations. Certain psychological phenomena are not consistently reflected in behaviors that would be easily studied. So many things rely on overt behaviors and not mental actions like addition. We can see people when we are observing them, but we can't see their thoughts, feelings, only what is expressed.